Today is part 2 of our review of The Quest for the Historical Atom by William Lane Craig. Welcome to Apologetics from the Attic, the show that seeks to teach and defend the Christian faith in a post-Christian culture. And now, broadcasting from an attic in an undisclosed location somewhere outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, here is your host, Dave Lewis. Hey, welcome back to another episode. This is Dave Lewis. And let's just jump right in because this video still has 40 minutes of it, and we'll probably have to do a part 3 knowing me and how long-winded I go. But Dr. Craig had just finished talking about the genre of mytho-history. If you want to go back and listen to part 1, I encourage you to, if you stumbled upon part 2. And he just got done making the point that many Old Testament commentators actually believe the way he does, but they won't use the term mytho-history because they are squeamish about it. They don't want to use the term because they have an evangelical audience, I think was kind of the point he was making. So anyway, let's continue. Now Sean McDowell follows up with another question.
A few minutes ago, you said all New Testament scholars agreed that history starts at Genesis 12, moving forward.
Did I say New Testament or Old Testament?
You said new, but I assume you meant old, just for clarification.
Yeah, I didn't mean new.
Okay, got it. Just want to make sure for listeners. Okay, so what you're saying is history as we look at it normally, for lack of a better term, Genesis 12 clearly has that form of history. There's a shift in the narrative after 11. So 1 through 11 is proto-history, mytho-history that contains some history, but also some other stories that weren't meant to be taken historical. Is that fair as far as it goes?
Yeah.
So before Dr. Craig answers that, in case you're just joining us, remember he's this genre of mytho-history, which is not to be taken literalistically. He's still saying it contains a kernel of historical truth, but that kernel of historical truth, now this isn't the language Dr. Craig uses, I don't think, but this is the language I think is helpful because Protestant liberalism, since Schleiermacher on, has done this for years, for generations. And then, of course, Rudolf Bultmann, who famously dubbed the project de-mythologizing the Bible. Now, Dr. Craig wants to limit this category of mytho-history to just Genesis 1 through 11. But I don't understand how he can successfully limit it to Genesis 1 through 11. And remember, Dr. Craig is an apologist who's attempting to make the Bible palatable, acceptable to unbelieving scientists, to give them a foot in the door to have faith. And this is about to really come out. And this next part was actually the most controversial part of this interview that went all over Twitter with some conservative evangelical types, fundamentalist types getting on and really reacting negatively to this next part when he starts talking about the Garden of Eden and kind of mocks it. Well, you be the judge.
Weren't meant to be taken literalistically. When you look at myth, what you discover is that myth is often written in figurative language, often fantastic language, and therefore wasn't taken literalistically even by those who accepted the myth as authoritative for their culture.
Okay, so if this approach is correct, how should this shape the way, in your view, we read Genesis 1 through 11 then, and the story of Adam and Eve?
I think it should prompt us not to be over literalistic in the way we read these narratives. And once you begin to look at them in terms of mytho-history, it's difficult to look at them in any other way. I mean, when you read a story about two people in an arboretum with these magical.
Before he goes off on that, he just made a presuppositional statement. Once you read these in this way, it's hard to read them any other way. Yes, Dr. Craig has adopted a presuppositional approach to Genesis 1 through 11 that does dictate how he reads it. But once again, I don't understand how this doesn't extend into Genesis later on when it talks about God coming down with two angels, three human beings, and they look like they're in human form, but they're God, and then they go in and they rain fire down on and destroy the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. How is that not a fantastical thing? I don't know how he holds this, so that's why I would be interested to see him debate a Protestant liberal who would nail him to the wall on why are you just limiting this mytho-history category to Genesis 1 through 11. It should actually be applied to the entire Bible, including the ministry of Jesus, which, as I said, Protestant liberals have been doing for a long time. Let me go back here. So here's where he starts talking about, listen to how he describes the Garden of Eden story.
Not to be over literalistic in the way we read these narratives. And once you begin to look at them in terms of mytho-history, it's difficult to look at them in any other way. I mean, when you read a story about two people in an arboretum with these magical trees whose fruit, if you eat it, will grant you immortality or knowledge of good and evil, and then there's this talking snake who comes along and tempts them into sin. And then you have this anthropomorphic God walking in the cool of the garden, calling out audibly to Adam in his hideout. You think, well, of course this is figurative and metaphorical language. This isn't meant to be read in this sort of literalistic fashion.
So that was the part that got a lot of controversy. Some people were saying he was laughing at it. Sean McDowell isn't laughing. So I heard they're laughing at it. Sean didn't laugh at it. Talking snakes and arboretum and tree that grants you immortality and anthropomorphic God. That statement, those couple sentences, that paragraph Dr. Craig just said there about describing Garden of Eden. My question is, couldn't what he just said about the Garden of Eden be put into the mouth of an unbeliever, an unbelieving scientist who mocks the Bible, and there wouldn't be any difference? Now, Dr. Craig saves it by saying, well, it's not to be taken literalistically, but everything he just said about the garden and Adam and Eve and the tree and the snake and God walking in the garden, I don't see how an unbeliever wouldn't just say the same thing and mock it. Like literally the exact same word for word what Dr. Craig just said, an unbeliever would say the same thing and it would be no different. In other words, this is the language of unbelief. So Dr. Craig can state this, and then the unbelieving scientist goes, oh, wow, okay, so interesting. So you do agree with me that Genesis 1 through 11 is nonsense? No, I'm not saying it's nonsense. It's mytho-history, see? It's mytho-history. It's not nonsense. I mean, the way I just framed it makes it sound fantastical and that there's no way that ever happened historically, but there's a historical kernel underneath it that you need to understand. I'm just trying to explain to you that's what's going on here behind the scenes. Apologetically, what's going on is Dr. Craig is coming up with a framework to make Genesis 1 through 11 and Adam, especially the human origin that's presented in Genesis, palatable to neo-Darwinians, palatable to those who believe that we evolved from apes, which Dr. Craig believes. That's what he's doing. Let's continue.
And so once you begin to see these narratives this way, I think you begin to ask yourself, how could I have read them any other way? It would be like reading Aesop's fables literalistically, as really about talking animals, for example, rather than.
Wow. So the Bible, now, to be fair to Dr. Craig, only Genesis 1 through 11. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, only Genesis 1 through 11. Don't know how he holds the line on that, but good luck to him. The Bible's like Aesop's fables. Now, to even make that comparison says a lot about where he's headed in the trajectory he's going down as he thinks about the Bible. Because the path he's headed down is that the Bible, this is the end path of Protestant liberalism that views the Bible this way, that it's got historical kernels of truth wrapped in mythology or mytho-history, is that at the end of the day, the Bible is a record of primitive human experience of God. It's a record of their religious experiences that we must transcend because we're modern people and we have modern understandings and we have grown past the Bible. We've grown out of the Bible. Now, the Bible can be a touchstone. The Bible can be very authoritative and very important. So that's why it's interesting to compare. Go back and listen to 2 episodes ago, John Shelby Spong, and my review I did of him and what William Lane Craig's program is here.
Than as figurative or metaphorical in order to teach some moral lesson.
Okay, so apart from the New Testament, which we're going to go to in a minute, in which you argue 1 Corinthians 15 and Romans 5 make it clear that biblically there must be a historical Adam, Genesis 1 through 11, taken on its own merit, you've given examples of why you think there's clearly these fantastic mythical elements involved in it. Is it the genealogies and the connection where it stops in Romans 12 that convinces you there's a historical component behind this?
In Genesis 12. Now, I caught you giving the wrong reference. You said Romans 12.
Good call.
Yes, that is exactly right.
Okay, fair enough. So last question.
But there are genealogies before Genesis 12, right? There's the genealogy that traces the line of Adam to Noah. So I don't understand. I think the lifespan issue for Dr. Craig, that people were living to be 800 and 900, he thinks is mytho-history, and no one ever lived that long. I would have asked him that question. I don't think it comes up, but I'm curious if Dr. Craig takes literally the idea that people lived to 800, 900 years. I think he would say that's not true. That was just a mytho-historical way of describing some historical reality that isn't literal to be taken literalistically.
Would you say, when you mention Aesop's Fable, I can imagine people saying, wait a minute, this is totally made up, not historical at all as far as I know. Maybe I'm getting that wrong. But would the ancients have read Genesis in this fashion, or do you think they took it more literalistic?
You know, I don't know, Sean, if there was a kind of universal way of interpreting these passages. One of the things that I rebuke Old Testament scholars for in the book is the presumption of saying things like, ancient Egyptians believed that, or ancient Mesopotamians believed that. I don't think we know what most Egyptians or Mesopotamians or ancient Israelis believed. But I think we can say that there are elements in these stories that exhibit this sort of mythological literary genre, which the author and his audience would have recognized to be fantastic if they were taken literally. And that therefore that gives good reason to think that they were not always taken in a literal way.
So there's the language of a presupposition of appealing to unbelievers to try to reason them into the faith. Well, I don't know what. Moses, and I don't know what I don't know what the Old Testament authors would have thought about Genesis 1 through 11. Don't know. Do you know what Jesus thought about Genesis 1 through 11, Dr. Craig? I mean, this idea that we don't know, I mean, it's very in vogue if you are trying to be respectable in the academy and endear yourself to atheistic, unbelieving Darwinians, and to say, please, please, don't put me in the camp of thinking that there was a literal Adam and Eve in a literal garden, and there was a literal tree, and there was a literal snake, and God. Don't put me in that category. Obviously, that's foolish. But let me give you a way that you can accept me into your group of atheistic Darwinians. And let's, Dr. Craig's wanting to win them to Christ. I don't doubt that. But the way he's going about doing it, is it ceding too much to the unbeliever? And is it the slippery slope that leads to the John Shelby Spong approach, which basically says the entirety of the Bible, including Jesus himself and the Gospels, are also in this genre of mytho-history, that clearly Jesus didn't walk on water, raise people from the dead, feed thousands of people with loaves and fish, control the weather, cast out demons. That's all mythological too. That's fantastical. And then, of course, Dr. Craig would never want to concede that the resurrection is a fantastical event, which I'm thankful for. But this is like one of those things where you're poking holes in the ship, and it may not sink right away, and you may not see the effect of how it's filling up with the waters of unbelief, but it eventually will sink the ship. And that analogy from Van Til, he had the Queen Anne, which was like the Titanic, I think. I don't know if the Queen Anne was before or after the Titanic, but it was a gigantic cruise liner. And he always used as an analogy of the Christian is on the Queen Anne. That's the church. That's the truth. That's presuppositional truth, that the Bible's the Word of God. A priori, don't need to prove it, in some type of evidentialist way. And you just speak to unbelief and address unbelief from the position of truth. And Van Til would say that this type of approach, so wait, let me back up. The Queen Anne is sailing on the water. The water represents unbelief. So there's people out there drowning in unbelief. The nature of humans, to doubt God, to hate God, to doubt his revelation, to view the Bible as nothing but foolishness and mythology. This would be like somebody jumping out of the Queen Anne into the water, trying to build a ladder out of water to get the person onto the Queen Anne. That's the project of Dr. Craig. This is what Van Til would say about it. You are attempting to use the tools of unbelief to get someone into the church. So you're conceding that, of course, there wasn't a literal Adam and Eve. Of course, there wasn't a literal garden. Of course, none of this actually happened in history. Now, there's a historical kernel there, but of course, it didn't actually happen in history. I know I've said this 50 times, but I want you to come away from this review understanding what's going on, be at a deeper presuppositional level here with Dr. Craig's approach. All right, let's continue.
Okay, let's shift to the New Testament and talk about what this contributes to the historical Adam. And there's a lot of passages, whether it's in Matthew 19, Jesus, whether it's Acts chapter 17. We won't have time to go into all of those, which you do in your book, but make a distinction for us between what you call the literary and the historical Adam.
This is a distinction which is widely made among New Testament scholars when it comes to dealing with how the New Testament treats figures in literature that the New Testament authors cite. So, for example, when they talk about Moses, is this the Moses that actually lived, or is it the Moses as described in the Pentateuch? When they talk about Adam, is this the actual historical Adam, or is this just the Adam of the story? And you cannot assume too quickly that the literary figure is the same as the historical figure. We all know examples in our own day where we will say things like, just as Robinson Crusoe had his man Friday to help him, so I have an assistant who helps me in my research. And that doesn't commit me to the historicity of Robinson Crusoe. It's just a reference to this literary figure.
So Adam and Moses are like Robinson Crusoe, a made-up fictional character. Just want to point that out. Let's continue.
Here. And one of the contributions, Sean, that my book makes that I'll be very, very interested to see how people react to is I show that the New Testament authors cite mythological and fabulous figures from Jewish folklore and Greek mythology that I think none of us want to be committed to historically. And so these would be prime examples of where the New Testament authors are using these literary figures to illustrate Christian doctrines and truths, but they don't require us to believe in the historicity of those figures any more than my reference to Robinson Crusoe requires us to believe in the historicity.
Oops, sorry, we got to add. My bad.
In between breath, take a shot.
Sorry about that.
Historicity of that man.
So is it fair to say the reference, if they reference non-biblical literature, it doesn't mean it's not historical, but we can't assume that it is?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
That is correct. Though, in some of these cases, we have really good grounds for thinking it's not historical. For example, the figures of Jannes and Jambres that are referred to in 1 Timothy, you can show the history of this pair in Jewish folklore, how it evolved, and the wild legends about Jannes and Jambres and the magicians' contest they had with Moses and all the rest. To think that this is really historical would be a wild stretch of the imagination.
Okay, so let's see how he applies this. So once again, okay, so now we are taking the framework that he claims he was only going to apply to Genesis 1 through 11, and now he's applying it to the New Testament. Now, he shifted the approach from mytho-history to literary versus historical figures. But understand something. The move that Dr. Craig is making here is, in effect, to once again try to make the New Testament palatable and acceptable to atheistic Darwinian scientists. So, of course, the New Testament has instances where fictional, non-historical characters are used to make points, to make references. But of course, Jannes and Jambres he's talking about, we know they didn't exist. That's a made-up Jewish folklore. So see, Paul there's a category where Paul takes folklore, literary figures, they're not meant to be taken historically. So therefore, unbelieving atheist scientist, don't be so quick to write off the Apostle Paul. When he's talking about the historical Adam, he may just be talking about an early hominid. And we're going to get to that part. I got to get to that part. But just to notice what just occurred. The thing that was supposed to just live in Genesis 1 through 11 now lives in the entire New Testament. That's what just happened. All right, let's continue.
Or the example in 1 Corinthians where Paul talks about this well that traveled along with the Israelites through the desert during their wilderness wanderings. In Jewish folklore, there was this well about the size of a beehive that kind of rolled along on the ground, and then every night it would stop and it would yield water for the Israelites to drink out of. And Paul refers to this legend and says, and that well was Christ. Now, are you going to say that identification requires you to believe that this story about this traveling well is true? I don't know any.
Okay, wait a minute. So, let's put that aside. Dr. Craig, if an unbelieving atheist Darwinian scholar, scientist, came up to you and said, well, Dr. Craig, the Old Testament teaches, and the Apostle Paul agrees, that for 40 years straight, every morning, this thing called manna appeared in the middle of the desert. And the people for 40 years straight, millions of them, gathered up this manna every morning and ate it. You seriously think that occurred historically? What would Dr. Craig say? Would he take a stand on biblical truth and say, absolutely that happened? Absolutely. By faith, the Bible records that as a historical event. I hold to it. See, he can tinker around the edges and say Janus and Jambres and a moving well, but ladies and gentlemen, please, there's deeper issues here. Dr. Craig is trying to make the New Testament palatable to unbelieving scientists, but the unbelieving scientist is going to come along and say, dude, you're telling me, let's go over all this stuff. The Red Sea, seriously? You think that millions of soldiers were drowned in a sea that God parted supernaturally to allow millions of other people to walk across it on dry land? You think that happened historically? And give Dr. Craig another 5 years and he's going to say, no, it didn't happen. Now, this is all mytho-history. And then, unfortunately, what's going to end up happening is the resurrection itself becomes mytho-history. This is the slippery slope. And I'm sure Dr. Craig's aware of it. But he's got blinders on because he's trying to make the Christian faith acceptable to unbelievers. He's jumped off the Queen Anne and is trying to build a ladder of water out of water to get people into the church. It doesn't work.
Anybody who thinks that's true. So in some cases, it's not simply that we can't assume that it's historical because it's cited by a New Testament author. But in some cases, the stories, again, are so fantastic that I think we can say, no, this is plausibly not historical.
So Dr. Craig is pointing out a couple stories that he considers fantastic. But Dr. Craig, you understand that all unbelieving Darwinian evolutionary theorists believe the Bible's fantastical. The entirety of it. Not just the couple examples. They think that the ministry of Jesus is fantastical. They think that the resurrection is fantastical. How do you address them? How do you address that? How do you put that in a different category? That's what I don't understand. And in his mind, he shifts between, okay, this is mytho-history, kernel of historical truth, but clearly not to be taken literally. And then notice the shift he made. He also has a framework to apply this to the New Testament authors. He does. Because, I mean, you could say, okay, Genesis 1 through 11, super ancient, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. But now we're dealing with the New Testament, which is still an ancient document in terms of scholarship. But, you know, it's a different category now. But he can still apply his framework to that.
You can say it's not historical, but in 1 Corinthians 15 and Romans 5, you say it's also not just literary, and we have reason to believe it is historical. Now, we could parse these passages in great depth, but just tell us kind of as simply as possible why you think those passages are best interpreted as requiring a historical Adam.
Very simply, because a literary figure cannot have effects outside of the literature in which that figure appears. The person Hamlet in the play by Shakespeare was supposed to be a Danish prince who actually lived, but there was no such person as Hamlet. So Hamlet can't have any sort of effects outside the play. But what Paul asserts about Adam is that through Adam, sin came into the world, and because of Adam's sin, all men died, and sin reigned from Adam to Moses, a historical period of time. And we're still dealing with it today, says Paul. And so it seems to me that because of the extra literary effects of this figure cannot be purely literary, but must be historical.
So you don't go into how that sin is passed and whether it's...
Well, so that's good. I'm glad Dr. Craig is holding the line on saying there is a historical Adam, and we see the effects of the fall of Adam today. So I'm glad of that. I'm glad he says that.
Imputed, or whether it's our nature is corrupted or it's guilt. But your point being, whatever model it is, the Bible teaches that something objectively is passed on, which takes us out of literature into the real historical world.
I do, in fact, give a discussion of these different ways in which Adam's sin might have affected us and express my skepticism concerning the original culpability view or the corrupted nature view. And I offer a version in terms of sin's effect upon society, and it's permeating all of our cultural institutions and environment in which a child is raised. But then at the end, I make the point that you just made, that whatever view of the effects of Adam's sin you adopt, whatever view you take, it's going to require a real historical person and not just a literary figure.
Just so you don't miss it, Dr. Craig is a modern-day Pelagian in terms of his view of original sin. So he just articulated that Adam's sin just made society bad and our environment bad. It did not make human beings inherently corrupted. He rejects that. I mean, it's once you start realizing how many people reject original sin as historically considered, accepted by the universal ecumenical church, it's quite fascinating. Because remember, Pelagianism was soundly condemned by the church, and you got someone like William Lane Craig comes along and says, "Nah, this whole original sin thing I don't agree with. I think our environment's bad, but we're born good." It just blows your mind.
Okay, good. Let's shift to, you started with science and you started with scripture to do your best to understand it on its own merits. And then you shift to the scientific question. So just tell us kind of broadly, how do you approach science? What's kind of your philosophy of science that would shape how you think about it and maybe its integration with theology?
Well, since my question is, am I as a Christian in conflict with contemporary science as a result of my biblical commitments, I simply accept what the deliverances of contemporary science are. Now, that doesn't mean that I believe in them or defend them. I simply assume them. I say,
this is a very important part. Did you hear what he just said? So when it comes to scripture and modern science, he accepts, uncritically assumes the deliverances of modern science, and in this case, neo-Darwinian evolutionists, as correct. And then what his task is to make the Bible somehow acceptable to, in line with, those deliveries of science. So the Bible's not given this same benefit of the doubt for Dr. Craig. You're not going to accept the truth claims of Scripture in the same way you uncritically a priori accept modern science. Hope you heard that. It explains a lot. This is called presuppositionalism. You have to understand the presuppositions people are working with. Dr. Craig's presupposition is that Enlightenment style, humanistic, positivism, we could go down a road on all the things. And Dr. Craig knows much more about these things than I ever will. So I'd love to hear him talk, though, about the history of science since the Enlightenment. And Dr. Craig has to be aware of all the projects since the Enlightenment that have gone on since the 1700s, 1800s to relegate the Bible to the religious studies department and purge it from any scientific department in any university, which is the people who he's trying to appeal to. They would tell the people who study the Bible, get over to that religion department, stay put, don't even venture over to our hard science department. Don't even come over here. We don't deal with myth and fantasy and metaphysics. That belongs way over there. And is Dr. Craig, just for the sake of respectability or trying to make Christianity respectable and the Bible respectable to these people, is he going along with that? And saying, yeah, guys, I agree with you. The Bible belongs over in the religious studies department. You're right. It's mytho-history. It's this and it's that. So this part is fascinating. Let's let him continue to describe this and explain how he takes the research of modern humanistic, atheistic, Enlightenment science more seriously than he does the Bible. Now, he wouldn't want it framed that way, but that's the path he's headed down.
Given that there was a historical Adam, or that the Bible commits me to a historical Adam, then assuming what modern science has to say about human origins, is there...
Let me say something. I take Dr. Craig's word for it when he says the Bible commits him to a historical Adam. But could it really be what's going on is to keep his evangelical conservative audience, he's committed to a historical Adam? Because there are many, many, many Protestant liberal scholars who would say, the Bible doesn't commit you to historical Adam. What are you talking about? So that statement right there, that the Bible commits him to an historical Adam, is not I agree with that statement from a presuppositional a priori standpoint. But you got to understand, there's a lot of people who would say, no, Dr. Craig, let me explain to you why it is that the Bible doesn't commit you to historical Adam. You don't have to be committed to an historical Adam. And then, of course, the unbelieving atheistic scientist says, well, you believe in a historical Adam? What is wrong with you? You're still accepting the ravings of this guy, the Apostle Paul, who claims that he had an encounter on a road and the risen Jesus of Nazareth appeared to him. You believe all that stuff? I mean, that's the thing. The supernatural worldview permeates the entire New Testament, which to an atheistic evolutionary biologist is just anathema. Like, what is this? You think there's anything historical or literal to be salvaged in this? Maybe the Jesus seminar guys that say Jesus was a first century Jewish sage who was apocalyptic, and like 10% of the stuff that Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John capture is actually what he wrote. 90% is just people later adding and massaging the story to make it what they wanted it to be. But anyway, I'm sorry. Let's continue.
There's some conflict between my biblical commitments and the deliverances of contemporary science.
Okay, that's really helpful, because in the book itself, there's certain ideas of common descent and certain ideas of dating that could be consistent with an evolutionary model. Your point is, regardless of whether you personally embrace that or not, you're simply saying, given your biblical commitments, let's assume the deliverances of modern science and see
Yeah.
if they can be wed together in a plausible fashion. Is that fair?
That's exactly correct. And my
Okay.
contention is that even given the full blown theory of evolution of the human species, there's no incompatibility with my biblical commitment to universal human pair or progenitors.
So let's see how Dr. Craig does this. So I think this is the part where he explains his theory. So he's just saying that the evolutionary Darwinian theory that says we went from a single-celled organism that slowly evolved and mutated from one species to another, from a single-celled organism to a highly complex Homo sapien over billions of years, is compatible with the Bible. And it's compatible, though, with an original pair called Adam and Eve. Now, let's see how he does this. And I would be fascinated to hear a Darwinian respond to what he's about to say here. I would be fascinated to see an atheistic, humanistic Darwinian who's committed to that view respond to this attempt to wed the Bible with Darwinism.
All right, so let's unpack your approach a little bit in light of modern science. And obviously the question you're asking is, when did humans begin? And then let's see if that's consistent with a biblical model as you understand it. That raises the question, what does it even mean to be human? So what's your understanding of what a human being is?
Well, paradigmatically, we understand what it is to be human by ourselves. We look at ourselves, we know that we are human, and so we know what a paradigm of humanity looks like, somebody like ourselves. So there needs to be a certain anatomical similarity to us. That would mean that hominids in the past that didn't have adequate brain size, for example, would not be human. But mere anatomical similarity is not enough. What you want to look for would be those cognitive capacities that would be indicative of full human behavior.
Okay.
And here there is quite a consensus among scientists as to what kind of behaviors those would be. I cite a pair of anthropologists, Alison Brooks and Sally McBrearty, who explained that the indicators of modern cognitive human behavior would be things like planning for the future, symbolic use of materials to represent non-physical realities, advances in technology and inventiveness and so forth. And what McBrearty and Brooks then do is look for what they call certain archaeological signatures that are indicative of these modern cognitive behaviors. And they list around 20 to 25 of these archaeological signatures. Well, in the book, I have only time to discuss some of the most striking, but they are unbelievably striking, Sean. And I think what you can show is that these archaeological signatures of modern human behavior go back hundreds of thousands of years in Africa and Europe and the Middle East, indicating that human beings originated on this planet sometime before the divergence of the human race into different species like Neanderthals and Homo sapiens and Denisovans.
This part of your book to me was one of the most interesting, when you walk through the emergence of art, the emergence of tools, these very complex building structures that were made,
unbelievable
language development. I mean, it clear, like burying the dead. there's clear signs that these are people, human beings, whatever their size and body structure, that are sufficiently similar to us and would categorize as being human. Now,
I think that's right. And I am not willing, Sean, to write Neanderthals out of the human race. I think that kind of dehumanizing attitude is, frankly, morally unconscionable. It's a kind of racism in a way. These were people just as much as ancient Homo sapiens were, just as much as we are. And we should not dehumanize them in that way.
Okay. So then tell me, you said hundreds of thousands of years. When do you think when would you scientifically place the first human being sufficiently like us, which would help us know on your model where to place Adam and Eve, roughly?
So this is interesting. So all that stuff he just said, I don't know how much relevance it's like a internal thing that I'm not aware of, but Dr. Craig is uncritically accepting this progression of evolutionary theory where you have hominids and then Neanderthal and then Homo sapiens. He's just accepting that. No pushback. That's true. A priori, the scientists are correct. The Bible must be fit into that framework. Just that's how his mind works. That's how his apologetic works. That's how his program works to try to make the Christian faith reasonable. Reasonable faith is the name of his ministry. So let's see. Maybe this is the part I was thinking of where he explains the origin of Adam and Eve. Let's listen.
It would be somewhere between 1,000,000 and 750,000 years ago. Now, that's a broad range, but
sure.
it does narrow down very considerably the candidates for who Adam and Eve might have been. I think the best candidate is Homo heidelbergensis, or Heidelberg man, who is the most recent ancestor of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens. Now, and so probably the most novel thing in the book is my proposal to identify Adam and Eve as Heidelberg man.
Let me come back to that in a minute, but one of the big challenges that I've heard consistently against a historical pair is that the scientific evidence shows that human beings could not have gone back to less than, typically it's stated, a group of 10,000 individuals. Why do you disagree with that?
That calculation made by Dennis Venema and others was based upon interpreting human beings to be restricted to Homo sapiens. And you could not get an original pair of Homo sapiens in the recent enough past to be able to explain the genetic diversification of our contemporary population. But you see, I think, as I said, that's a prejudicial identification. Neanderthals were just as human as Homo sapiens. And so we need to push that original human pair back further in time to the most recent common ancestor of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. And when you do that, even Venema now agrees that anytime earlier than 500,000 years ago, population genetics cannot rule out the existence of an original human pair who are the universal progenitors of mankind.
I see some great questions coming up in here, and we are going to come to them. Be patient. I've got 3 more for you. Maybe paint for us. You have this in the very last page of your book, kind of in it's like an epilogue or putting it all together, where you say, here's what my model would look like if it were true. And again, I want to emphasize, you're not saying this is necessarily true. You're saying this is one way. You think logically modern science doesn't contradict the way you've explained Genesis. So for people trying to put this together, what would it look like practically? Like if you were explaining this to a kid about Adam and Eve, what might it look like? And you've written some kid books, so I can't let you off the hook for this one.
Okay. Now, assuming then, for the sake of argument, the truth of evolutionary biology.
Okay, so this is the part I think. And notice, assuming evolutionary biology, it's always assumed. It's assumed that the Bible must be reinterpreted, not taken literally, but evolutionary biology is absolutely true. Here's how he says that Adam and Eve came about from within a Darwinian evolutionary worldview.
Concerning human origins, we can imagine sometime prior to 750,000 years ago, a group of hominins, maybe a few thousand. And through a biological and spiritual renovation, perhaps divinely induced, a miracle that caused a genetic regulatory mutation in a pair of these hominins, they were lifted to fully human status and capable of supporting a rational soul through their brain and nervous system. And they would then begin to have children. And I think, given their full humanity, they would naturally tend to isolate themselves from their non-human contemporaries. In time, eventually, they and their descendants would supersede all of the non-human descendants, and eventually give rise to different species of human beings like Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, and Denisovans.
Okay, so tell me if I captured this. Essentially what you're saying, given evolutionary biology, modern science, whether you accept it or not is a separate question. There would be an evolutionary history up to about 750,000 to 1 million years ago. And then God selected through some supernatural process a couple out of this, breathed into them in a different fashion. They became the historical Adam and separated themselves from their ancestors. And this is the story that is not told in Genesis, but through mytho-history matches up with this story. Is that fair?
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Very.
So that's like a bow tie on the end of it there. So, yes, that's correct. What's correct is I have figured out a way to read into the text of Scripture what I want to be true about the origin of species that comes not from the Bible, but from modern science. And Dr. Craig's very happy. Yes, that's exactly what's going on. Now, I would love to see him debate a Darwinian who's an atheist, who believes the Bible is foolish. And I would love to see a cross-examination against Dr. Craig about this claim that there was a pair of hominids who God perhaps, notice he uses the word perhaps, he's a good scientist, nothing is, everything is up for grabs, perhaps supernaturally were lifted out of the condition, and by a miracle, there was a mutation given to them by God to give them a soul, and they could sustain a soul, and then they started reproducing. So that's really what Genesis 1 through 11 is saying. So that's the claim. Genesis 1 through 11 is saying that there was a couple thousand hominids, and God came in and gave a genetic evolutionary mutation to two of them and lifted them out of that thousands. That's what Genesis 1 through 3 is stating. That's really what's going on. And how do we know this? Because we have applied the lens of modern science to Genesis 1 through 3 and have determined that that lens tells us what really happened behind the scenes. And Dr. Craig, you'll probably never hear this, but if you do, my challenge to you is, how do you not apply this methodology to all 66 books of the Bible, including the ministry of Jesus himself, where you take what for many would be a supernatural claim, similar to God created the earth in 7 24-hour periods. God, out of the dust of the earth, supernaturally created a man, called him Adam. claims like that, which you say that's clearly not historical, that's mytho-history, that clearly didn't historically happen. There wasn't a literal pile of dust that God came down and gathered together and breathed into a living being. That's not what happened. Well, in the same way, how does that not apply to the ministry of Jesus? That when the Bible narrates miracles that Jesus did, when he walked on water and controlled the weather, how is that literal history? How can that be literally true? So he's making supernaturalistic truth claims, but trying to put them in the framework of a naturalism that rejects supernaturalism. I don't know how you do that. Because he just made a supernaturalistic truth claim. A miracle happened where God took a pair of hominids out of a couple thousand and genetically mutated them supernaturally so their bodies could handle having a soul. That's a pretty supernaturalistic truth claim, if you ask me. And a bunch of naturalists are going to say, oh, yes, Christianity is now reasonable to me, and I'm open to Christianity now because of this theory of that's being proposed. Maybe there are some that will. I'd like to meet those people.
Very interesting. Now, there's a lot of questions here we'll come to in a minute. Two things about your conclusion. You say, at the very end, you say, Adam and Eve may therefore be plausibly identified as members of Homo heidelbergensis, and as the founding pair at the root of all human species. Bill, after all this research, it's only plausible? Of course, I'm playing the skeptic with you, but is that what you conclude, that it's just plausible?
Yes, I'm not trying to prove that Adam and Eve existed or that they did belong to Homo heidelbergensis, but what I'm saying is that this would be a view that is fully consonant with modern evolutionary biology, with all of the evidence about human origins, and with the biblical commitment to a single pair of human beings who were the ancestors of every human being on the face of this planet, who fell into sin and through whom sin and moral evil entered the world and infected the human race. And that's not just a possible scenario, Sean. That's a plausible scenario. Okay. It's fully in accord with the evidence. And so
the question that, ultimately at the end of the day, is Dr. Craig attempting to put a square peg in a round hole? What I mean by that is the round hole, as he clearly articulates over and over again in this video, is modern Darwinian evolutionary theory, the scientific consensus of humanistic atheists who rule the roost, and when it comes to biology departments and anthropology departments in major institutions of higher learning in America. That's the round hole. The square peg is the Bible. So Dr. Craig is saying, well, I have come up with a framework that makes this square peg fit into the round hole, and you evangelical literalistic Christians need to understand the square peg that represents the Bible is actually round. And I've given you a framework to make it so you can fit them together. Because we need to make Christianity and the supernatural claims of the Bible acceptable to modern man, acceptable to modern scientists, acceptable to the academy. Because, of course, they think we're foolish to say that the Bible teaches, and it's literal fact, that God created the heavens and the earth in 7 literal 24-hour periods. That God created Adam out of the dust of the ground and breathed into him and made him a living being. That there was a literal garden, paradise, somewhere on planet Earth that Adam was placed into by God. That there was a literal tempter, serpent. I mean, that whole thing, like, okay, that's ridiculous that there was an actual snake. But is there evil? I mean, is that palatable to naturalistic atheists who believe in Darwinian evolution, to say that there is a malevolent evil force who exists in another realm that is a supernatural being who is Satan, that there was a global flood, that Noah built an ark, and the Tower of Babel. Well, these things are all mytho-history. And once again, what's your guard to make this stop bleeding into the New Testament, which I'm not just saying a slippery slope argument that hasn't happened. This is what happens. Let me see what my time is here. All right, I'm out of time. Google Seminex controversy, Lutheran seminary in exile, and do some research on, this is the Lutheran seminary in St. Louis, Missouri, Concordia Seminary, St. Louis, and how they fought off successfully this very thing. That there were professors in there, and they started saying, well, Jonah being swallowed by a fish. I'd love to hear what Dr. Craig thinks about that. Is that mytho-history? Was Jonah literally swallowed by a fish, or did that not actually happen? And that one's interesting because Jesus said that it happened. That's a myth. That's not true. And then you start to head in that direction, and they started doubting the historicity of Adam. Or here's the other one, Peter Enns, right? Pete Enns, who used to work at Westminster Seminary, Philadelphia, who is now a full-fledged, full-blown, on the BioLogos forum, denies the historical Adam, and he started off in ways that seemed innocuous to a lot of people. So that's really the takeaway from this is, as Christians, we need to think through our presuppositions. And we need to ask ourselves, is the Bible something that, yes, apologetically we can clear away objections to the faith that science may bring? But is your apologetic not to do that, but instead to try to change the view of the Bible from literal history to something else in order to make it more acceptable to those who carry different presuppositions about a supernatural worldview and their commitment to positivism, of scientism, of the idea that, only science gives truth, and what we can observe in the here and now gives us truth, what we can repeat in a lab, et cetera, et cetera. And, that's an entire debate about epistemology and how can we know what we know and where does the Bible fit into that. Let's see. Let's play until it gets to the questions. I got 3 minutes.
I think it's actually a pretty strong claim to say this isn't just possible, but this is really plausible.
Okay. Very fair. Helpful. Last one, you make this statement, then we're going to questions, is in the very end and kind of this afterthought, you conclude by saying the conquest of Adam and Eve will never be concluded in our lifetime or in any lifetime. How do you know that it would never be concluded with advance in genetics and history and paleontology in, say, 1,000 years?
Yeah. I say that because of the sparsity of the evidence that is pertinent to paleoanthropology. These hominid forms are extremely rare, and therefore it's very, very difficult to reconstruct the path of human origins. I have some diagrams in the book that show the areas of uncertainty, and it may be that Homo heidelbergensis might be supplanted by some other human species. As I say at the end of the book, at least for now, it serves as a kind of convenient placeholder for that most recent common ancestor of Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, and other members of the human family. But given the incompleteness of the evidence, I think it's unlikely that we'll ever be able to bring the quest to a close and say, aha, here, yes, Adam lived in 801,232 BC.
Got it.
In the Persian Gulf oasis or something like that.
Okay. Fair enough. Here's a great question for you. I'm really interested.
Yeah, so I've always wondered about that. I remember people talking about it, young Earth creationists, and then even people who are old Earth creationists but reject Darwinian evolutionary theory. If Darwin's theory is true and the modern Darwinian theory is true, why aren't we literally finding hundreds of thousands of these hominid forms in the ground? Why aren't we finding these hundreds of thousands of Neanderthal skulls and bodies and bones? I mean, why aren't they? There should at least be more than a couple, right? I mean, I would think so. I mean, I guess they could decompose and be gone, but why aren't we finding more of them? I guess it's just from hundreds of thousands of years. If you buried somebody today, 100,000 years from now, their bones wouldn't even exist, right? They'd be turned back into dust. So I guess that could be an explanation. Let's listen to the first question, and then we can close up.
How you'll answer this one. Kevin Connor says, hey, WLC and Dr. Sean, agnostic atheist here. Is there anything in your historical Adam theory for people like me, or is this theory only meant for Christians as a way to harmonize beliefs?
It would be meant for Kevin only if one of the reasons that Kevin has for his unbelief is a supposed incompatibility of the primeval history of Genesis with modern science. And I do think that for many unbelievers, that is a major obstacle to their becoming Christians. Now, maybe it isn't for Kevin, but if it were, this would definitely be something for him.
Yeah, so we'll end there. So that's a very good place to end. At what cost is Dr. Craig's program making? At what price are we paying for Dr. Craig's program of making Genesis 1 through 11 acceptable to someone like Kevin, who's an agnostic atheist? At what theological cost? I think it's too high of a price. And I think that this road that Dr. Craig is heading down, if it doesn't stop in 5 or 10 years, he will be considered as every other Protestant liberal who've used the Bible as merely the record of human experiences of God in the past that we need, and modern people need, to cut through the mythology of all of it, including Jesus himself, which I know Dr. Craig would vehemently deny. And he would hold that Jesus of Nazareth, bodily raised from the dead supernaturally, and that occurred in time. And if you were there, you would have witnessed it. Now, how an agnostic atheist accepts that truth claim through scientific method or science, I don't know. But this is where presuppositionalism versus evidentialism becomes an issue, if you want to study that out. So thanks for joining me. We got through the rest of it. I mean, there's still 13 minutes of questions and answers if you wanted to finish the video out on your own. But I hope this has been helpful. Thanks for joining me for this edition of Apologize from the Attic. Visit the website, subscribe to the podcast, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook. Thank you so much, and God bless.